Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are glad that you've decided to join us for another podcast over at No Trade Clause. This is episode 123. I'm your host, Aaron Washington. Co-host Avi Tyagi joins me once again. We have been partnering up on some division breakdowns. So that's one part of our coverage here for the lead into the 24-25 season. This time around, however, we are going to break down a huge trade that just went down here just a few days ago for us. This is the New York Knicks / Minnesota Timberwolves / Charlotte Hornets trade that involved Karl Anthony Towns and some other great players, some picks, some cash. As we will get into a little bit later, this is a very complex trade that almost didn't happen, but the Knicks front office they pulled some incredible maneuvers to make this happen. They just had an incredible level of genius and ingenuity here to make this all happen. So we're going to get into that, but very impressive stuff from all sides to make this trade possible. Avi, glad you're back in the saddle here. Going to be an exciting talk about this trade. This is fascinating for a lot of reasons, as we'll get into, but glad you had the time to join me, and hope you're staying cool with that heat wave going on there in California right now.
I mean, I'm trying to stay cool. The AC can only do so much. But yes, I'm really excited to talk about this trade. The minute that this trade was announced, even like the rougher details of it, which was basically DiVincenzo and Randall for Karl Towns, I had a feeling this was going to be fascinating. And then you start digging more and more into the mechanisms that the Knicks were going to use to try to make this happen. And there was a little bit of a confusion about whether they'd be able to get it done because some of the players weren't even currently on their roster. It was maybe the most interesting trade I can remember from the last 5 years. So I'm excited to talk about this.
One disclaimer I want to put out there for our listeners before we get started. If you are watching this, you may notice that I am wearing a Minnesota Timberwolves t-shirt. I want to make it known before we get too deep into this that I am not a Minnesota Timberwolves fan. I just had this sitting in my drawer. I had a trip to Minnesota. I had a layover in Minnesota earlier this year and decided to pick up a little bit of a souvenir. That's all it is. And I want to show them some love too, because they're getting a lot of hate based on what I've seen in the wake of this deal. So I wanted to bring some good vibes towards the Timberwolves way in this podcast. But we'll get into them here a little bit later. We'll talk about how this all worked out for them, getting some players back in this deal. But we're going to start with New York Knicks on this podcast here for this trade. So I'm going to go over the specifics of the trade from each side. I'm not going to list them all at once. I want everybody watching this to be able to kind of follow us and the trail we're taking, getting towards the end here. So I'm going to break it down team by team, but we're going to separate them out in this podcast. So it's going to be essentially 3 parts to this. Obviously, the Knicks are going to take up a large majority of it, the Timberwolves, and then the Charlotte Hornets will be a little bit towards the end, just because they didn't have a ton in this deal to give or take, but they did have an involvement here. So we want to touch on them and how they made this all possible, because this does not happen without the Charlotte Hornets. So we want to acknowledge them here as well. But before we get into that here, the New York Knicks, let's get into it, Avi. They made a humongous trade here. This is their second huge trade here since the end of last season. This is crazy. So they already picked up Mikal Bridges from the Brooklyn Nets, made that happen. And then they doubled down on going all in. So I can see why the Knicks did this. They already probably should have made the Eastern Conference Finals. They just got decimated by injuries and bodies were dropping left and right. But they had the talent to get at least to the Eastern Conference Finals. So in their mind, they're on the doorstep of a championship. So they said, hey, why not go out and get 2 more great players to stick into the starting lineup and make this team even more formidable? So what they got back in this deal was obviously Karl Anthony Towns from the Timberwolves, and they also got the draft rights to James Nagy from the Charlotte Hornets. James Nagy, okay, he's in the deal, but the headliner here is Towns. He comes back here. He's with the Knicks. He's with Tibbs again. We'll get into that here in a little bit, that whole relationship between Tibbs and Towns. But first and foremost here, the Knicks had a little bit of a dilemma to make this trade happen. You look at Towns and the salary that he's making this coming season, $49.3 million, almost 50. You go and look at the other players coming back, it doesn't match. And that's significant because both of these teams are over the apron, so they cannot take back more money than they're sending out. So they had to make this a money for money trade, equal money being sent out. So the Timberwolves sent out 49, and the Knicks only had 43 million. If you look at Randall, DiVincenzo, and Keita Bates Diop in this deal. So they said, okay, we're almost there, but how do we get that last 6 million or so to make this trade legal? So they gathered up some two ways, made them officially standard contracts, and only guaranteed. You only have to guarantee the first season. So you have the first season guarantee, and I believe there's two more seasons non-guaranteed. But they did basically the bare minimum. And what's even more interesting here, Avi, is that they did not sign these guys to the minimum. But if you look at it, it looks kind of like the minimum, but they put each player $1 over because like they you can't sign and trade these minimums. So they said like, hey, okay, that's fine. $1. We'll throw you $1 just to make this thing legal, which is crazy. I mean, I've never seen this before. And to your point, this trade is just crazy. It kind of just breaks the boundaries of what we've seen happen before. And honestly, the Knicks kind of exposed a loophole here in the CBA that I'm sure they're going to look to close later. That's going to be kind of interesting how they navigate this. But in the meantime, the trade is legal. They made it happen. They found the extra 6.3 million. So they signed and traded Jeffries, Washington, and Brown to make this trade happen. They go to Charlotte, and then that kind of brought them in compliance with the CBA rules and all that stuff. And, that would take too long to kind of like list them all out. But essentially, they found the money to make this work. So they sent those out. Basically, it was also tricky for the Knicks because they're hard capped at the second apron. And that is because they did that earlier deal for Mikal Bridges. So when you do something like that, you aggregate salaries, you pile them together, you become hard capped at the second. So they couldn't go over that. But what's even crazier, just to kind of pile onto this, they found a way to stay under the apron. But a big reason for that is because of what they did in the draft, if you can believe it, all the way back in June. So they signed the rookie. I have no idea how to pronounce his name. I'm going to put that out right now. I'm sorry, guys. But Bakome Diet.
Dadier, yeah.
Diet, okay. Thanks. Thanks, Avi. I wasn't quite sure how to put that out there, but we'll go with that. So they signed their rookie for 80% of the rookie scale. So when you have these rookie scale contracts, they are all set for a specific dollar amount for each pick in the draft. So for him, the Knicks said, hey, we're going to sign you to 80%. So the range of outcomes here is between 80 and 120. Most players are towards that 120. But for this rookie here, he signed for 80%. You got to think that the Knicks knew they would do something like this, because why else would you sign a rookie for 80%? It kind of like tells me that something was brewing even back in June. So they signed him for 80%. And by doing that, they saved about $900K. And that's crazy because they only finished this trade under the second apron by $792,000. And for most people, you look at $792,000, you're like, that's a lot of money. In the NBA, it's like this small of a margin. It's very small. So kudos to the Knicks again for making this happen. Very creative to get this all to work together in the rules of the CBA. And yeah, they did expose a loophole. One last note here before I hand it over to you, Avi. There were draft picks involved in this. So the Knicks had to trade some picks to get this to work too. So they had their own 2031 second, which they traded in this deal. They had I believe what is a second rounder from the Warriors in 2026. They also traded. And then they were due a protected first from the Pistons. It was protected from 25 to, well, initially 24, but 24 to 27. They let that go as well. And that's headed to the Timberwolves. So they had to they had to let some picks go. So between this and the Bridges trade, a lot of picks here that they sacrificed to get these players. But hey, if they make it to the finals or something like that, and these guys mesh together, it's all worth it in the end. All the extra money they had to pile on and all the picks they sent out. Kudos to the Knicks to make this happen. It's a big sacrifice, but for win now deals like this, you don't even think twice. You make it happen. So, Avi, what are your thoughts on this, and how are you feeling now that Karl Anthony Towns is a member of the Knicks?
My first thought is, applause there for the summary. That was really well done. I love how you took it all the way back to the draft, because that is true. When the draft happened and you saw them draft Dadier, the first thought was, hey, maybe he'll be a draft and stash. because depending on how they end up filling out the roster spots, I wasn't sure at the time. But yeah, red flags were raised the minute that they drafted him in the first round and then signed him to 80% of the rookie scale. That was a really interesting move. And it does give some indication, especially with some of the reporting that's come out, that they may have had their eyes on Towns the whole time. But the brilliance of them being able to trade away Daquan Jeffries, Charlie Brown, and buy out Dwayne Washington from Partizan, and then sign those three to contracts that are $1 above the minimum so that they could get this trade across. I mean, it's absolute brilliant. I can't believe that they
Crazy,
pulled this
man.
off.
Yeah,
I don't think I've ever heard of this ever happening in a trade before. As far as I'm concerned, I'm pretty sure this is unprecedented. So
hmm
I hats off to the Knicks and their cap guys over there for figuring this one out. I
for
mean,
sure.
yeah, you can see very quickly why they wanted to do this trade, especially when you consider that Hartenstein left. And all the news right now about Mitchell Robinson is based around the fact that one, we don't even know if he's going to play for this team because he might get traded. And two, even if he does play for this team, we're not 100% sure when he was going to come back. So they
hmm
had a glaring hole at center. And no matter how much Knicks media or how much um, comments from Tibbs indicated that, hey, maybe I'll feel more comfortable playing Randall at center this year, nothing about Tibbs's history indicated that that would ever happen. I don't think Tibbs would ever let Randall play center just because he's not a natural shot blocker. Even
hmm
though he has the size to go against centers at times, he can't block shots in the same way. Vertically, he just doesn't generate that burst. And he is a little bit small height wise as well. If he wanted to play center, he doesn't have those measurables. So it made perfect sense that they were going to go for this move. And then you get into the history of Karl Anthony Towns with Leon Rose and William Wesley, and it seemed like this was going to happen. The surprising part was more that the Timberwolves chose now to make this move happen, but as we'll get to once we get to the Timberwolves portion of this, it kind of makes sense why they chose this moment to make this trade happen.
For sure, Avi. And yeah, I mean, it's really incredible that, the Knicks, made this happen. And I mean, it's kind of funny because, like, if you're one of those really hardcore fans and you look at every little detail and every little signing that happens in the league, you can probably kind of piece together this trade in advance before it happened. You can kind of see where
Yeah.
they were going. You can know the former ties between Towns and all the other guys in the Knicks front office and the coaching staff. So you can see that. And then Dottier signing for 80%. And like the puzzle pieces were kind of there before. But if you don't follow the league that closely and all the inner workings and things that happen behind the scenes, it can really blindside you. And I'll admit, for me, it kind of blindsided me as well. For the main reason that I was surprised from the Wolves perspective more than the Knicks perspective. For the Knicks, it's easy to see. Like, for the reasons you mentioned, getting a center, trading for a center, we talked about this earlier
Yeah.
a couple weeks ago. Like, hey, they're going to make a trade for a center. I think that was pretty easy to figure out just because there's a glaring hole there. You can't play Precious Achiuwa 30, 35 minutes. Like, he's just
Yeah.
not that caliber player. He has his own shortcomings. So they needed to make another move to kind of shore up that position. So we were thinking in our minds, like, oh, okay, like you threw out Robert Williams, which, by the way, he's hurt again.
Yeah,
Shocker.
I know. It's just
Yeah, that wasn't going to happen. Just
when will he ever be healthy, man? Just once, please.
this trend of injury-prone centers getting injured before the season starts is crazy. Mark Williams,
Yo,
Robert Williams, and Mitchell Robinson. Crazy stuff, man. I mean, they're just kind of like, it is what it is at this point. Like, I just feel like they're just never going to be healthy, which sucks because all of them are really good players. I hate that for them. But back to the deal, like, I was more surprised that the Wolves did this, and right now they were ready to kind of switch up this roster considering the season they had. And I don't want to get too far into the Timberwolves yet, but that's what kind of shocked me a little bit that it happened right now. But shifting over to the Encore perspective here, this is another interesting facet of the deal to look at because Towns brings a really valuable skill to the Knicks that they honestly need. And I can't remember this exact specifics, but NBA University on Twitter tweeted out something recently, or maybe it was another account, but somebody made a graph of teams and basically their spacing, the amount of spacing that each team had last season. And the Knicks were towards the bottom in terms of spacing, like open threes and just everything that goes along with like having good clean shots from three. They lagged way
Yeah.
behind the competition in that. We have Randall and other players like that that don't generate a ton of threes. It's tough. There's limited spacing there, but you bring in Towns, you bring in his 5.3 attempts per game. That's going back to last season. Could be more now. Over 40% shooter. That's pretty much every season. He's dead on 40% or more. That's super valuable. And for a guy like Brunson, you think about what Brunson does on the court, you think about what OG does on the court. Those guys love going towards the rim. And for Brunson specifically, it's not that he's going to get all the way there all the time. His frequency at the rim is actually below average. But when you look at the short mid range frequency, that is where he makes his money. He he shot about 36% of his shots last season from the short mid, 95th percentile for guidance position. And he hit 52% of those, which puts him in the 86th percentile, according to Cleaning the Glass, when it comes to efficiency. So now he's going to have more opportunities to get in close where he does so well. And OG, with his big body, great frame, willingness to attack the rim, there's going to be more opportunities for him. And because of all the attention that Bridges is going to command and Brunson's going to command, like Towns is going to have just as much space, if not more space, to get off his threes that he hits at a very high clip. So when you look at all those pieces working together, it makes a lot of sense. And something else that I don't hear many people talk about is the ability of the Knicks to run a double big lineup the same way that the Timberwolves did when Towns was with Gobert. Theoretically, they could do it. I don't know how receptive Tibbs is going to be to that idea. It's definitely it seems like it's kind of a little bit of a counter to what he usually does or like the rotations usually runs. But if he's willing to kind of switch it up a little bit, you can run Towns at the 4, you can run Mitch Robinson at the 5. So you do have that rim protection that he loves so much. And you have Towns able to space the floor. And he's used to playing with a guy like Mitch Robinson. Gobert plays pretty much the exact same type of basketball. So from that perspective, could open up some things for them. It's an option. I don't know how much they're going to run it, but it is an option for sure. How do you feel about the Towns fit on court? Do you think it's going to be seamless? Do you think there's going to be a growing pains? How do you feel about that?
I think it's going to be seamless just because of the way the chemistry Hartenstein and Brunson had together. I think there's a chance we get similar chemistry from Karl Anthony Towns and Brunson just in a different way. Hartenstein, I think, is a better natural passer, but I think you can still actually pass the ball to Karl in the post and have him dime up cutters. I think it's something he improved on a lot, especially last season working with Finch, and because they had Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Edwards, Conley. You have this rotating cast around you. It was his second season working in the system. So I think as a passer now, he's pretty much improved every year, even compared to where he was 3-4 years ago. He's a much better passer now. He's not as good as Hartenstein, I think, at the handoff game and at dribble drives, um, DHO handoffs and stuff with Brunson as Hartenstein was, but I think he's still pretty good. Karl Anthony Towns, though, what he can do as a pick and pop spacer, he brought an element of that to the Timberwolves a couple years back when Tibbs was the coach, where he would work with Teague and with Jimmy Butler, and he actually had good chemistry where he would set the screen and kind of pop out back there. So I think the amount of spacing that will open up, especially when you're playing lineups sometimes with Hart, and if you're trying to do a double big lineup, I mean, that's the way you can kind of make it work. If you have a McBride who's not like a high volume shooter, if you've lost DiVincenzo, who was their most high volume shooter and broke the record for most threes by a Knicks player last year. So to try to make up for that, now you have someone who can offer that spacing element that the Knicks otherwise might have lost, even though they've added Mikal Bridges and even though Anunoby is a good shooter. Towns is a different type of shooter. You don't see bigs like him who shoot 40% from three, but only around 12% of his threes come from the corner. Like he's shooting 40% on threes that are primarily above the break. That is a very, very atypical for a center.
Mm-hmm.
Like Julius Randle, he shot 38% from corner threes for his for pretty much his entire career. but his 3-point percentage tended to be really low. Why? Because he's shooting so many of these pull-ups and taking so many more difficult attempts from above the arc, and it was just completely tanking his percentages. The amount
Right.
of spacing you now have up top so that you can put maybe weaker shooters like Hart in the corner, it's an added benefit that you don't immediately see. But I think when you start looking at plus minus data, it's why you could argue some of Towns' strongest plus minus data came in 2017 and 2018 when Jimmy Butler was running the show and he was kind of second in command. I think you could end up with almost a similar situation this time. So offensively, I think the fit will be seamless.
Definitely.
Defensively, it, it how do I put this? Towns' foot speed has always been a concern, and I think that was part of why him and Tibbs didn't get along so well the first time, because defensively his fundamentals on the move, if he's having to be the sole big, sometimes is a little bit problematic. If you bring him into an action, you can't really count on him to hedge. Hedging is hard anyways, but you can't really count on him to do that. You don't really want him to switch either, because in the amount of time that it takes for him to switch, the amount of little steps he's taking, he's already behind. And even if an advantage wasn't created for the ball handler, by the time Towns is even in him so long, in itself creates an advantage for an offensive player. So you can drive right by him, and now your defense is in rotation. And you're starting to get shots now at the rim because Towns is out there and you're playing four spaces around him. You might not have secondary shot blockers. That's the sort of thing where I feel like Tibbs will start to freak out by the time it's January. And that's kind of what happened in the past too. So that's where I'm a little bit more worried, especially when you have Brunson, who's a smaller point guard. Could you bring those two into an action and just cook every time? But that's maybe more of a playoff concern. In the regular season, I think you'll probably be able to play drop coverage enough with Towns, and he's actually a pretty decent shot blocker, so you might be able to survive.
Right. Yeah, I can see those concerns defensively. I agree with you on those points. But I think a counterpoint to that, though, or I guess a silver lining, is that
Yeah.
the Knicks have such a good defensive foundation kind of going into this. Like, you think about Tibbs and the way he's been able to optimize teams defensively over his career. That's definitely a plus here. And I think it gives Towns a chance to be at least decent, be at least average. I wouldn't say that Towns he's a great defender per se for the reasons you mentioned, but I think he can hold his own, and he at least has the size to kind of hang around and be decent. If I remember correctly, in that Denver series last year against Jokic, he actually didn't do terribly matching
Yes.
up against him. So that's definitely a plus, and it kind of gives a little bit of hope that Towns, especially in this system, can hold up and not be a complete liability. When you're surrounded by OG and Hart and Bridges and having Tibbs as your coach, I think it gives him a little bit of relief there. I mean, they did the same. Some of those guys did the same for Brunson last year, but when you have guys on the wing that can switch and they can guard up positions, especially OG, like OG is so strong and he has
Yes.
great size himself. It's really going to help Towns. So if he is caught in a mismatch or something like that, having OG able to take someone bigger, having Hart able to rebound. I mean, Hart secured a few triple doubles last season because he's just that much of a great rebounder at 6'4", which is crazy. But for those reasons, I think Towns has a chance to be at least okay. He has a lot of protection around him, so to speak, when it comes to his defense. So that's definitely going to help him out. You did mention DiVincenzo before. It does suck because you look at the volume of threes he took, and he actually, according to NBA University's graph of guarded catch and shoot attempts last season, he was first in attempts, catch and shoot, guarded shots. So for a guy like DiVincenzo that shoots a lot of threes, a lot of contested threes, still hit a high percentage, that's pretty impressive there. So losing that hurts a little bit, but it does give opportunities to the players that were playing alongside him off the bench. So you look at Miles McBride, there's been talks that he could start possibly. I don't know how likely that is, but Miles McBride is a solid player, and him getting some more minutes isn't a bad thing necessarily. And I haven't heard a lot of people talk about Tyler Kolek really at all, but he's
Yeah.
already 23 years old. Like, if you believe it or not, he's not a 18, 19-year-old player that you're going to throw in the G League for 2 years. Like, this is a guy that might be able to play some spot minutes here and there. Looks like he's one of those players too. It just looks like he has a good basketball IQ. Like, he just knows how to play the game. he has a play style that I think is it kind of reminds me a little bit of a Brunson, honestly. Like, he's not going to blow by people. He's not super explosive. He's not the most dynamic player, but he just knows how to play the game the right way and use what size he does have to his advantage. So those two guys could get some minutes here in the void that DiVincenzo left. I don't see many people talking about that. There's going to be more opportunities for him.
Yeah, there definitely will be more opportunities. I mean, this team did lose some depth. Even Keita Bates-Diop, I mean, uh, he's not maybe a memorable part of the trade, but just having another forward there, I think does make a difference. And if we go back to last season, the way we were talking about Keita Bates-Diop, at least the way I was talking about him, and I think I saw some people on NBA Twitter as well doing the same. He had a good season the year before, so there was a little bit of talk of, hey, for under $5 million, if you're looking at a forward, he's a pretty good option. So yeah, there are more minutes available now. And when you draft, I was very high on Tyler Kolek. So I think he might be trying to compete with the campaign for some of those backup point guard minutes. The way they've used Miles McBride, they haven't really let him run the show as a backup point guard. I'm kind of curious to see if that changes now. Opportunities for someone to step up, and one of these guards is going to have to, because this team is starting to look a little bit thin if you go past their main 5 or 6.
Yeah, and that could be a problem, especially if Tibbs does his signature, just running these guys ragged and bodies start dropping. We know Mitch Robinson's going to miss some time, so lack of depth is a little bit of a concern. But hey, it's going to be time for some of those other guys to step up and show what they're made of. So that's a positive for them, for sure. So let's get over to the Timberwolves side and see what they gained in this deal, what they lost, what they gained. Breaking down the trade from their perspective, or they received Julius Randle from the Knicks. They received DiVincenzo from the Knicks. They received Keita Bates-Diop from the Knicks. And they also received a top 13 2025 protected first from the Pistons that the Knicks did own previously in this deal. So they got that technically from the Knicks. So looking at what they gained here, first and foremost, they gained some flexibility. So between payroll and tax payments, they're going to save about $26 million, which is not an insignificant amount of money. I mean, ownership is sure they're ecstatic about saving $26 million. They are still over the second apron, which is $188.9 million, so still a little bit over that. Randall did receive a trade bonus of 15%, which brings his salary up from $27.6 million to $33.1 million. So about $5.5 million extra dollars in this deal. I want to mention that as well. So a little bit extra money for Randall, ups his salary. This is significant because they need to find a way to get Naz Reid back next summer. So if you open up a little bit of flexibility there, a little bit less money on the books, it does help them in that respect. Gobert, interestingly enough, is extension eligible. So he has a $46 million player option for next season. So I think another reason why they did this deal is because they looked at these two players that are significant parts of the rotation, and they said, like, hey, like, how can we bring these guys back and not just be so far? Again, they didn't want to be in the same boat as the Suns, essentially, where like your payroll is just so far out in outer space to where you're paying $100 million in tax payments and you're losing your 2031 first. It's frozen. It's in the back of the first round, and like all these other stipulations that come along with that. They wanted to avoid all that. So they lightened the load. We'll have to see what they do with Randall's contract, because that's expiring here pretty soon as well. So they have some decisions to make, but I think the more time that passes, I can understand it more for the Timberwolves. Now, I can understand it definitely from the salary cap side. The on-court side, I mean, I still understand why they did it, but I have some questions there. I have some doubts for sure about how that's going to work out. But yeah, strictly for the money, you can see why they did it. They wanted to save some money here. And then getting a first rounder from Detroit, not really the worst thing in the world. So you look at the protections here, top 13 next year. I doubt that conveys.
Yeah, I doubt it too.
Yeah. Top 11 and 26. Basically, I don't think there's a realistic chance, like a real serious chance, this pick conveys until at least 26, maybe 27. Yep. 26 is top 11, 27 is top 9. So once we get there, then it's like, okay, I can see this pick actually coming to the Timberwolves. I mean, come on, the Pistons can't be terrible forever, right? Like eventually they got to maybe get up to like the play-in territory or
That's
something.
true. Yeah, they can do that.
Yeah. So I would think at least in a couple of years, okay, they're in a position to where like they're not in the bottom and their pick is top 8, top 9, then it conveys to Minnesota. So with Minnesota and their position, they've been in recently like selling a lot of their picks, with getting Rob Dillingham and getting these other players in there. It helps to replenish their draft capital stash a little bit as well. So those are the particulars from the money side. But what are your thoughts, Avi, on making this deal here, shedding some money, getting some flexibility for future moves?
I like it in terms of the flexibility, and I really like the addition of Dante DiVincenzo. I like Randall here kind of as a wild card. I think, as I think I discussed with you and Oliver earlier, I could see Randall by the end of the year, maybe come playoff time, coming off the bench just because now they have DiVincenzo. DiVincenzo might give them a kind of upgraded version offensively of what they already have in Nickeil Alexander-Walker and let them lean into the best version of this team, which might be, at least for a starting lineup in a playoff series against a team like the Mavericks, Edwards, Gobert, and then having three great wings around them who can defend really well and can actually put the ball on the floor and score every once in a while. So that would be Nickeil Alexander-Walker, it would be Dante DiVincenzo, and it would be Jaden McDaniels. Because even Conley, for as great as he is, in the highest level of a playoff game against the Mavericks, you kind of don't want to present the sort of defensive mismatch that Conley presents at this stage of his career. You're kind of trying to slowly phase him out. That's part of also why you draft Rob Dillingham, because you see a point guard prospect in your eyes who in the future, if he improves defensively, he gains a little bit of strength, maybe he can kind of take the reins and develop into a starter. So I think for the next 2-3 years, that's kind of the mold that they're aiming for. And while Randall will start the year, I expect to see a lot of staggered lineups just because what makes Randall interesting and what makes him such an effective player is how good he is kind of at floor raising. What I mean by that is with the Knicks for the last 2-3 seasons, he's piling in these seasons, sub all-star or all-star level seasons, depending on how you view him, by taking a huge amount of touches for offenses that are absolutely starved of shot creators and generating decent shots out of it for the most part. So among bigs, depends on let's say big forwards. So players who are 6'7" or above and weigh more than 225 pounds. There's only a small list of players who shoot more than 3 pull-ups per game, shoot better than 35% on catch and shoot field goals, and a drive to account for more than 6 points per game. So as in like their driving game is actually a really important part of their game. Those six or seven would be Doncic, Durant, Kawhi, Paolo, Randall, and LeBron James. And then I guess, Embiid, if you really want to count him, but he's kind of a big. So that's kind of the list that Randall kind of occupies himself in. And he's actually a decent passer when you're feeding him touches, and he's kind of getting to make those reads from a ball-dominant position where he's getting to survey the floor as the ball handler rather than just quickly surveying off the catch. With the Knicks, as soon as they shifted to this Brunson offense and when they completely committed to it with DiVincenzo and all these other pieces in the back half of the season, once they traded away RJ Barrett quickly and got OG Anunoby, after this playoff run when they had completely committed to this model, to me it seemed inevitable that at some point Randall would be traded because once you saw how effective this was, you almost never want to go back. With the Timberwolves, I think with Karl Anthony Towns being gone, one of the problems that they faced actually in the Maverick series was a lack of secondary shot creators because Conley at this stage, you don't really want to count on him as a secondary shot creator. And then you're just kind of looking around like, I'm sorry, what am I supposed to do here? Mm-hmm. Towns, I don't want to say got exposed, but offensively, because he's not the sort of person who can generate pull-up shots, he's good at generating maybe, I don't know, 1 shot per game in that sort of setting. But in a playoff atmosphere when you might need more, he can't really provide you that. And that's actually where Randall's strength is. The fact that he puts the ball on the floor, the fact that in these settings where it becomes defensively really tough, points per possession numbers decline so much in the playoffs in these really tough series. At that point, even though Randall's not a great shooter, A Randall shot at that point in a playoff series might actually become more valuable than it is in the regular season, just because of how
Mhm.
much efficiency has fallen. And you need someone to soak up those touches and to provide that secondary scoring. If you
True.
even look at how they approached the draft, what was the biggest appeal with Rob Dillingham and Terrence Shannon? It's the fact that these are two young shot creators who have proven to be efficient at almost every type of scoring. They're good
Yeah.
at catch and shoot. They're good at isolation. They're good at off of the handoff. They're good spot up. Like in almost every attribute you're looking at, these guys are very good shot creators or shot makers. So that was kind of what the Timberwolves had told us their MO was going to be coming into the season. And now that you've made this trade and you've gotten Randall and DiVincenzo, you've added, I would argue, maybe two decent playoff ball handlers. Because the biggest difference between DiVincenzo and someone like Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who's actually in a similar mold, defensively they're of a similar play style. If anything, I think Nickeil Alexander-Walker is actually a better defender. The difference is offensively. DiVincenzo is a superior cutter. He's probably better at operating on the break in transition with the ball in his hands. He's better at running pick and roll as a secondary option if you need to. And he can actually shoot off of handoffs. The Knicks were actually starting to use some of that last season. So my
Hmm.
guess is Finch wanted him because he saw him as a creative outlet and a creative secondary piece who maybe long term, actually, he might want starting with Edwards until Rob Dillingham develops into whatever they anticipate he might in the future. So I can see why the Timberwolves made this trade, and then you get into the salary relief element of it, the fact that you need to keep Gobert and Reed. Then you look at the fact that the Timberwolves ownership right now isn't even settled. It's going to be settled in November based off of arbitration, and we still don't know yet which way it's going to lead. Both sides are trying to sway the court of public opinion about who's trying to shed salary, who's not, who is going to get to keep this team and who's not. So right now it's completely unsettled. So you can see why Connolly and company decided now was the time to strike, and we have to try to aim for the big bad wolves of the Mavericks and the Celtics. And based off of our current Karl Anthony Towns model and the fact that we already just lost Kyle Anderson and Monte Morris, we don't seem to have a path to take a step forward, and our future might just be us taking steps back. So this was a big upside swing to try to find some um, find some players who can better fit what might be the ideal model for our franchise.
Yeah, to that last point you just made, yeah, I think that's definitely a primary reason why they made this deal. They looked at what happened in the playoffs,
Yeah,
and they didn't really add anybody significance other than Dillingham. And Dillingham is probably not going to be in a position to like help you win a playoff series in year one.
yeah,
He's
he's
going to
not.
need more time to develop and just get stronger, get more confident, get more accustomed to the NBA game. So that just kind of left them with the same roster. So I guess in their mind, they're thinking we're going to run into the same problems. We're going to have the same cap, the same ceiling. And for the amount of money they're paying that roster and the expectations they have, it's not enough. So even though they had one of the best seasons, arguably the best season in franchise history,
Yep.
they elected to shake it up, take Towns, who has some good trade value there, and move him and go for Randall. And yes, like you made a great point about the deficit of shot creation that they had in the playoffs this past spring. And bringing in Randall, I'm kind of divided on it and like what he's going to provide the Wolves and if it's going to work out for them. On one hand, you look at what he's going to do inside the arc, what he can do inside the arc, looking at the numbers on cleaning the glass, efficiency marks at the rim and mid range are very solid. I
Yep.
see a lot of above averages. The last two seasons, he's shot in the high 60s at the rim. Very good marks. He's been in the low to mid 40s from mid range. Pretty good. Short and long mid
Yep.
range, good numbers there. Nothing, not going to compare him to Kevin Durant or anything for that from that range, but solid. Can definitely get the job done. But the other side of the coin is the 3-point shooting. Can he shoot threes? Yes. Can he shoot them efficiently, consistently? That I think is the bigger question. When you go and look at effective field goal percentage, which is giving more value to the 3-point shot, uh, when you kind of break down a percentage field goal percentage for a player, the marks aren't great. So it's been a lot of up and down. I think that's one of the most interesting parts of Julius's percentages over the years. You look at the 2021, 51.7% effective field goal percentage. The next year goes down to 46. The next year jumps back up to 54%. And then last season goes back down to about 51%. So there's a lot of inconsistency I see with that. The 3-point percentage kind of goes up and down. One season it's low 30s. The next season it's mid 30s. So you called him an X factor or a wild card earlier. I think that's the perfect way to describe him. I think it could work if he gets back to mid 30s from three on solid, decent frequency. He's not taking a bunch of pull ups and a bunch of contested threes late in the shot clock. He could be a pretty efficient shooter, but there is a reality in which he is back in the low 30s and he's not acting as a great floor spacer. And when you already have Gobert, I think that just creates even more problems for you. And you look at the other players on this roster, you look at or in the starting lineup, like Ant, yes, he's going to be a decent, good 3-point shooter. Jaden McDaniels, pretty decent shooter as well. But neither of those guys are going to just like strike fear in the opposing team, which brings us to DiVincenzo. I think it was really good that they got him in this deal. It kind of it justifies it more from their perspective. We just got done talking about how he can hit different types of threes, off of movement, off of catch and shoot, takes a lot of them, commands a lot of respect from there. So for all those reasons, like he's going to plug right in and help shore up some of those holes that are going to be there with maybe McDaniels and Randall, specifically Randall and Ant-Man. Like those two guys, there's a lot of this when it comes to the 3-point percentage. Like from game to game, from the one part of the season to the next, I mean, they're very hot and cold. So if you have DiVincenzo, very consistent. We know he's going to shoot at least high 30s, if not in the 40s this coming season. And it's going to help their offense a lot. So to kind of add it all up and summarize it, I do like the trade overall. I can understand it now more than before. Does it give them the chance to be like a champion, in the finals? I wouldn't bet on it. I'm still very skeptical of that outcome for them. I don't see them as a true contender after this deal, but I think they're going to win a lot of games again. I think it'll be a very good team, and their future is definitely brighter now with having less on the books and having DiVincenzo's contract, which got to mention it's might be the best value in the league. It's one of the best values.
Fantastic.
11.4 next season, this coming season. 11.9 the season after that. 12.5 in 2 seasons in 26, 27. And there's no options. No player options for anything. So mid-level money for DiVincenzo is incredible. And you got to applaud the Timberwolves for getting a player that fits into their team this well, gives them so much what they need at a very reasonable cost. So for all those reasons, good on them. I just don't think it kind of makes them flat out better than they were before the trade. And I don't really see this trade putting them firmly in the championship conversation.
I think I agree with you, except I will say one thing. I think this trade did something meaningful for them. It increased their variance. It increased the size of the tails of their outcomes. With Karl Anthony Towns, once Anderson and Monte Morris had left, I think you had kind of established the system has kind of taken itself to its fullest capacity. And based on what this team is, we think that this might be a conference finalist level team. And there's a chance it repeats like that again next year. No guarantees, but we think that this team is of that caliber. With Randall, I think I can't say this enough. He might be, especially once this trade has happened, he might be the biggest X factor of any player on any team this season. Because this could either all crash and burn, and he ends up being traded for a bunch of spare parts, and maybe they don't have the secondary shot creator going into the playoffs. Or, and I might like to present. I can't believe I'm doing this, but I think I might like to present a theory for how Randall could work and actually make them championship contenders. I think there is an upside outcome here. You've already gone over how Randall is actually a decent as a rim finisher and as a mid range, but it's his 3-pointer that's been, shall we say, inconsistent, right? Over the past few years. Mm-hmm. Well, as the stats I remember, I texted this to you earlier. Over the last 4 seasons, Randall has a history of shooting around 30% on pull-up threes and taking around 2 per game. That's probably too many for what you want Randall to shoot. If you go look at his shot diet as well, he's barely shot any corner threes. Corner threes only make up about 15% of his total three-point output over the last couple seasons, and he shoots about 38% on those. So what I think has to happen here is Randall needs to realize he's not in New York anymore, and he's shown a capacity to do this when he was on the Pelicans. I thought on the Pelicans he was a very good player in a smaller role, and I thought he was kind of underrated. When he went to New York, he's become a star. The question is, will he be ready to go back to being a well-paid player, but someone who isn't going to get that star load in terms of touches and maybe even in terms of media treatment and points and stats as he used to have with the Knicks? Remember, at times with the Knicks, there were times when I don't want to say they were butting heads, but you could tell that Randall was mad just the way he was talking to teammates or the way his body, his facial language, it was getting angry on the court. You would see it sometimes defensively with his effort, but an energized version of Randall, I think, gives you the best bet to try to guard Jokic the way Karl Anthony Towns did, because against the Nuggets, what they were having them do is, because the Nuggets love using that in the dunker spot play so much, you could do something like put Karl Towns on Jokic and have Gobert back there, ready to swat shots away. And because Towns is so big and strong, and Jokic isn't exactly going to beat you with speed, Towns was actually a good matchup against someone like Jokic to try to hold down his efficiency to keep the Nuggets offense from, going loco the way it typically does. Randall, as a body type, he might be shorter, right? So he won't be able to block shots the same way. And Jokic might feel more comfort shooting hook shots over him than he did over Towns. But body type wise and in terms of strength, Randall is a worthy adversary. So you could maybe run some of that same defense against the Nuggets and hold up and maybe beat them. And then against teams like the Mavs or the Celtics, you have a better option now. If Randall is willing to accept the fact that he needs to focus on efficiency, he was getting 72 touches per game around about last year and the year before that. I'm sorry, that's going to have to go down to maybe 55 or 60, right? In terms of pecking order, Edwards is now going to be the main man getting the most touches, and you're going to have to slot him behind him. Where I might want you taking maybe one pull-up three per game, but that's it. Just to show a defense you can, but I don't want you taking too much. I want your three-point efficiency to be higher to make you a more effective offensive player. And then when we are running offense through you, we will have DiVincenzo, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and all these players making cuts. You're working with Chris Finch, who did a great job at developing Karl Towns' passing ability. We need you to do the same. You were working on it last year as well. So I think there is an avenue here where Randall can almost reimagine what he is as a player and maybe change the narrative on what he is as a playoff player, as a regular season player, what his style is, and become a really nice cog within a Timberwolves machine that wants the best parts of Karl Anthony Towns' game, but also wants to add some pull-up shot creation and wants to add better defensive mobility, because I think he is defensively more mobile than someone like Karl Towns is. So I think there is an upside option here where DiVincenzo just stays being what DiVincenzo has been the last 2 years, and especially last season. And Randall gives you the best parts of the two bigs, Towns and Gobert experience without some of the downsides. So I think that outcome is on the table. I just never know what to do with Randall, and I don't know if he is ready to accept that. But if he is, I think there's a chance that we could be looking at the Timberwolves in the playoffs and saying, "Wow, this team has much more flexibility in terms of how they can approach other teams than they did last year, even."
No, that's a good point for sure. I think I'm with you on that. That the range of outcomes is definitely wider than it was before. Yeah. So we're gonna have to see, but yeah, it just comes down to Randall's his willingness to slot into that system and to be just be an efficient player, to be a disciplined player, not get ahead of himself too much. I know Knicks fans can speak to his over eagerness sometimes, shall we put it, getting ahead of himself, maybe taking some ill-advised shots, driving into two defenders, turning the ball over, having a turnover percentage just being too high. But I think if he just kind of brings all that in check while still being an aggressive player and forcing the defense to respect him, it's going to work out really well for Minnesota. So this is going to be a fascinating time just to watch them and to observe how it all works out. Because he, like you said, he's going into a role that he hasn't really been in a few years. So it's just going to
Yeah.
come down up to his willingness to adapt to the system. So to kind of end this podcast, we do want to mention the Charlotte Hornets and how they fit into this deal. So they did receive those 3 players from the Knicks that were signed and traded. They were signed to just over the minimum by $1. Daquan Jeffries, Charlie Brown Jr., Dwayne Washington Jr. Their salaries for this coming season are for Jeffries, it's going to be 2.4. For Charlie Brown Jr., it's going to be 2.2. Dwayne Washington Jr., 2.1. That's because they do have different years of service. So their minimums, I'm going to say minimum, like it's close enough. Like it's $1 over. So I'm just going to put it in air quotes.
Yeah.
But those amounts are determined by their years of service. So Jeffries has 5 years. He's at 2.4. Then you got Dwayne Washington Jr. at 3 years. And that's why he's only at 2.1 million. So they get those 3 players. They can observe them, see if they fit in with what the team is trying to do here. And then if it doesn't work out, I mean, next season is not guaranteed for all 3. So there's no real future obligation to these players. You can let them go if you want. If they don't want to keep them around past the season, that's definitely an option for them. And then, of course, there's those 3 second rounders that they got in this deal. So the first is for next season in 25. It will be the less favorable of Denver's second and Philly's second. So not a crazy high value pick there. I mean, that's probably going to be mid to upper 50s in terms of what it is as. I mean, both those teams are title contenders. So, I mean, that's not worth much, but it's something. It's an asset. And then you have the Golden State second for 26. That could actually be a pretty good pick. You think about the Warriors, and Curry is aging, Draymond's aging. Wiggins seems to be kind of trailing off here. He's having a hard time just being efficient and being a consistent player here. They could be in kind of heading towards a new era of Warriors basketball in 2 years. So that second actually could be pretty good there in the 30s for sure. So we're going to have to see about that one, but that's a pretty solid pick. And then lastly is a New York Knicks second way out in 2031. Who knows what that'll be? I mean, there's no telling right now. It's too far out in the future. But the Knicks, for all we know, they could be rebuilding in 2031. So that's another asset that they have, and they build on what they do already have in each of these years, which isn't that much, to be honest. For a team that's this bad every year, they're not flushed with draft capital. I mean, they do have all their firsts, except for 25 is protected. It's lottery protected. So unless Charlotte makes a huge jump up the standings, that pick, they will keep, and then it will convert to 2 seconds in 26 and 27 going to the Spurs. But in this deal, yeah, they just built up their second round stash, essentially. Getting those second rounders is good. Second rounders do have an increased value in today's NBA. Teams definitely value them more than they used to. So it's always good to get 3 in this deal. And then they did get cash of $7.2 million in total value, which is good because if you look at the total amount of salary that those 3 players may combine, it's almost the same. They're very comparable. So you got the 2.4, the 2.2, and the 2.1. I mean, you're looking at close to $7 million all combined, and then they get 7.2 back. So essentially, that money just kind of counteracts the money that they took on with those 3 players. So you kind of see the rationale here with all the different types of assets they got in this deal. It makes a lot of sense for them. And basically, it's basically a no-cost accumulation of picks and players. And it's really good for a team like the Charlotte Hornets because they're still trying to find their way up the standings. They're still trying to get better. And if you're in this current situation where the Hornets are in, where they don't win a ton of games, they're not a great free agency destination, then you got to accumulate assets any way you can. You take on extra salary, you get more picks, you get cash, whatever you can do to get more swings at finding good, solid players to build the core, you take it. So I think it's pretty cut and dry. It's good that they got in on this deal. It's good business, and it just gives them more to build on in the future. So kudos to Charlotte for getting out on this deal. It helps them in pretty much every way.
And I think if you're the GM Charlotte. I think you really like this deal, not just because you got those 3 seconds for limited cost. Even then, maybe 3 seconds. Some of those seconds aren't that great. The opportunity cost might be there that hey, you could have used the space for something else down the line. It's possible, but then the fact that you get that 7.2 million and you can take that to ownership and say, hey, no matter how much you're this 7.2 million you're getting is actually more than the salary you're having to pay, and there's actually a small profit here. I think when you're a GM for a team with under new ownership, not to say that their ownership is cheap or anything, but just if you're going to ownership and you're showing, hey, we got 3 seconds here and I'm giving you a small profit, I think that probably does build some sort of trust and does build some sort of like, hey, I'm not just thinking about the team building in a way that's going to ruin your wallet or something. I'm thinking about this in terms of business sustainability and also team building in a way that I think ownership might appreciate, where they think, hey, I'm not just trying to, build the most expensive team and make you pay everything. Owner, depending on the owner, maybe they won't like that. So I think this is more of a relationship building trade if you're between a GM and an owner, if you're thinking of it from a Charlotte perspective. So in that sense, yeah, I think it's pretty fair.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, a lot more simple,
Yeah,
not so much gymnastics here compared to the other two teams. But hey, it's just it's good to be a third team in these trades sometimes because you can just be a conduit essentially and just make the trade possible for one or both of the other teams in the deal. So very smart. And I hadn't thought about the relationship building part of it, but that's definitely be a consideration here. It only helps just to make a
yeah,
deal like this. They did good business here for sure. So I think that brings us to the end of our pod here, Avi. I think we covered all the parts here pretty in depth, quite a bit. But it's been a fun time. Glad you were able to jump on. And yeah, we'll have to see how this goes. I'm sure we're going to be in contact here quite often this season to see how this trade works out for each team. But thanks for jumping on here this evening. It's been a good time.
glad to do this with you, man. I mean, I think these two teams are not going to be the two most interesting teams to watch at the start of the season, just because of how late this trade was completed as well. So we'll have
All
to
right.
see if there are any chemistry issues at the start, and it's going to be really interesting to see how Finch and coaches who I would say are maybe on the different side of the spectrum in terms of how they want to build defenses and how they build offensive sets. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens when you swap these two players and how they fit in on their respective teams and what their energy ends up being like with teammates and stuff. Because I think maybe the closing note I want to finish it off on here is Randall was a huge star, and I think Ben Stiller tweeted about this. Yeah, I think Ben Stiller was one who made a tweet about this. For if you're looking at it from a Knicks fan's perspective, when Randall came in, the Knicks were nowhere. The Knicks were adrift. The Knicks were just floating around, hadn't been in the playoffs in a while, hadn't had any sort of remote success. Randall came in and 3 to 4 years of relatively consistent success, primarily on his back. And we all know what Karl Anthony Towns means to Minnesota Timberwolves fans. So the fact that you're exchanging, I'm not sure if I want to call Randall a franchise icon yet, but the fact that you're exchanging these incredibly important pillars of these two franchises that for years had not had any success and are now putting them in almost completely opposite situations, it's going to be really interesting to see how they react. It'll be interesting to see how Towns reacts in his second go around with Tibbs, and it's going to be really interesting to see how Randall reacts to a different set of teammates, a different media market, a different coach who operates differently and connects with his players on a different level. Even a different star like Edwards, he's not the same sort of on ball touch dependent guy that Brunson is. So the relationships here are going to be really interesting, and I can't wait to watch both these teams.
I'm with you, man. And for anybody that was thinking, hey, couldn't they just made this trade mid-season, like trade deadline? No, it wouldn't have worked in the middle of the
Yep.
season because you can't sign and trade free agents during the season. So I just wanted to point that out as well. That bit of information actually I got from our good friend Yazi Goslin, who does some great work
Yes.
over on Twitter, and we've had him on as a guest before. So if you're looking for some great salary cap content, definitely be sure to check out Yazi. He does some really good work and
Yeah.
has
He
great
was
tidbits.
all over this trade. He was
He
he was
was
everywhere. He was doing a fantastic job. You should really go follow him as
absolutely,
well on Twitter.
absolutely, 100%. So thanks again, everybody, for tuning into this podcast. We hope you found it entertaining somewhat. Hope you found it educational. You learned something and really got a better understanding of how this trade went down, why it was possible, and how it helps each individual team in the deal. If you are looking for more content like this, you can find it on our website, notradeclause.com. No Trade Clause, all one word on Instagram, _clause on Twitter, X. We have a graphic that just went up on our social medias about draft capital, so you could check that out. And then on our website, we have our division previews going up, and we're almost done with those. So be sure to tune in leading up to the regular season, and we'll have just a little bit to say about each of the 30 teams across the association. So thanks again, everybody, for tuning in, and we hope to see you on the next installment of NTC. Take care.